Look, I'm for some sort of national healthcare system that takes care of people. But I think what we have learned, just by common sense and observation, as well as empirical evidence, is that people who smoke and drink and eat and don't exercise can defeat any health system, no matter how lavishly funded it might be. And that there's got to be some kind of component in it of...
They're the dead weight on the system, so to speak.
Well, you hate to be cruel about it, but you just... Look, if the entire population becomes obese, or half the population becomes obese, and they all wind up with type 2 diabetes, that's, what, $30,000 a year in treatment? I mean, there just isn't...
That I welcome this kind of examination.
We tortured some folks. The CIA is fundamental to America's national security.
There is a war going on, the battlefield's in the mind, and the prize is the soul.
I don't believe anything the government tells me.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Miss Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never.
Hi, I am Irv Kopi, host of Newbie Theater. Joe Brand and I agree.
Wait a minute, I want a woman.
All right, Cincinnati, it is time for this town to get down.
This is the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, this is Mark Crispin Miller. You are listening to the Midnight Rider News Show with S.T. Patrick.
Hello, America and the world. Welcome to the Midnight Rider News Show. I'm S.T. Patrick, your friendly neighborhood host, traipsing and traversing through the trials and travails that have so tempestuously and untruthfully been blasted into your eyes, ears, and minds by the state-sponsored talking heads, the court historians, and the textbook conglomerates that control information today. Well, tonight we have episode 165, Jim Pinkerton on news at the turn of the millennium. Tonight's guest is columnist Jim Pinkerton. First, however, my friends, let us clean this castle. Now, I am pleased to finally announce that we do have the Android app and the iOS or iPhone app available for STP Radio. Both will be in your app stores on your phone, so just go to those app stores on your phone and type in STP Radio. From there, they should just come up and you can download them right there. Of course, they're free, so don't worry about any kind of a cost or charge. And then what you do is you just open up the app and it should automatically play the station. Voila. Easy as that. Now, if you could also give us a 5-star rating at your app store, that's appreciated. You can do that from inside the app itself, so that makes it very easy. And your humble host will be debuting his own shows within the next week or so I hope you'll give those a listen. I think they're pretty fun. One show is an 80s show. That'll be on Wednesday afternoons Eastern Time, and the other will be an Americana classic country, kind of a bluegrassy show that will probably air on Thursday nights at 11 p.m. Eastern. The time is a little up in the air now, but it's going to be some sort of late evening show for the East Coast. Obviously a little earlier for the West Coast and those in Alaska, Hawaii, and around the world. So it's a pretty good thing. It's pretty exciting. I'm pretty happy with it so far, but I could also use the support. I could use your ears, as usual, and I hope you guys will join us. It's a really good station, and we have some great programming on the station, some great hosts, and you can see that schedule at WSTPradio.com. That is STPradio.com. Now, I know, isn't the station called STP Radio? Yes, it is. But when I was going to get the domain for the website, I couldn't, for some reason, get STP Radio. It was already owned, so I had to put that before the STP Radio. So on the App Store, it is STP Radio. But the website where the schedule's at is it is WSTPradio.com. And yes, again, the apps are free, so please download those. We'll be right back with Jim Pinkerton.
This is Nicola Tallis.
author of Elizabeth's Rival, The Tumultuous Tale of Letty Snowles, Countess of Leicester. For more on Queen Elizabeth I, Robert Dudley, and the woman who dared to romance and then marry the Queen's favourite suitor, listen to episode 56 of the Midnight Writer News Show.
You may know Jim Pinkerton from Fox News Watch, a program that analyzed the coverage of news events for almost 20 years. It had a bipartisan panel that was always really lively, always really interesting, though. I thought it was the best show of its kind, and we'll talk about that tonight. But he also spent some time in the Reagan White House in the 1980s, and he's been a Beltway columnist for over 30 years. Because of that, he does have an insider's perspective and insight that we're hoping to mine tonight. And there are a few things that I've specifically always wanted to ask Jim, so I was very happy when he said yes to our invitation, and I'm excited that he's here. Jim Pinkerton, thanks so much for being on the Midnight Writer News Show.
Thanks for having me on.
Well, Jim, the first thing that I have to ask you about is home. Now, you and I are both Illinois boys. You went to Evanston Township High School, Chicago, North Side. And but you went to Stanford for college. And I'm wondering, with one of the more beautiful universities in the country, Northwestern University, right in your hometown, how did you decide to go to Stanford?
Well, yeah, Northwestern is a great school. But I must admit, my goal back then was to get out of the Midwest and the snow belt to California. That was really, I was just firmly convinced that California was the future, and I wanted to be part of it. And and the fact that it didn't have snow, it was also kind of a plus to me.
Yeah, you definitely escaped the snow, that's for sure. It's been an interesting spring here in the Midwest, as it's been everywhere. Now, I've heard people talk about going east or going west, away for college, away from the Midwest, and they usually come back having learned one vital thing. Was there that one vital thing that you think you learned at Stanford?
Yeah, it's California, for all its flaws. They think differently. I mean, that was what I noticed. That again, Evanston, Illinois, Chicago is sort of midway between east and west, although it looks more east than west, I think. And so most of my friends went to Princeton or Swarthmore or places like that on the East Coast, and they were happy enough. But I could just see that as the years went by and I kept up with them, I could just see the difference that I had become more of a sort of a libertarian and West Coaster, and they were much more, East Coast and, frankly, liberal. And it was a substantial difference. And I realized California is as liberal and democratic as, practically as New Jersey or Massachusetts. But still, there's just a difference. There's a feeling of possibility and potential in California, I think, even today.
Jim, it really is interesting how we view regions today, how we view territories or parts of the country, or even parts of a state. I'm from the bottom third of Illinois. I'm from the Carbondale area, and I can remember my year spent in Chicago. Everyone sort of thought anyone south of I-80 was from the South. And if you look at a map of Illinois, you're really just talking about everyone south of Chicago, which is in the far northeastern corner. But forgetting completely that Illinois is not the South. Illinois fought on the side of the Union in the war, so it was always crazy how they thought that. But so you spent the 1980s though working as a staffer in the Reagan White House, correct?
I did, yes, sir. Beginning first day of inauguration was January 20th, 1981. I was there.
The 1980s. When I say I'm a child of the 1980s, I really do mean it. I grew up from ages 8 to 18 in the 1980s. So I sort of lived my childhood within the Reagan years and the constructs of the Reagan years. And that was sort of the background to all the music and all the films and, of course, all the politics and all the world events. But I was wondering what it was really like to be in the White House. We've read a lot of Reagan history. I love to read about those years, and I've read that people like Don Regan were tough personalities and people who were hard to deal with. But who were some of the people that you personally just absolutely adored in that White House?
Well, I guess the first off would be the late Lee Atwater, who I worked for from inside the White House and then in the campaigns and so on. I worked for him from 1982 to 1989, and then was a pallbearer at his funeral 2 years later. That's one. Lynn Nossiger, Ed Rollins, Martin Anderson, who was the domestic policy advisor to President Reagan for the first year or so of his term, and was a major intellectual figure of that era. He wrote a great book called Revolution about the Reagan administration. It's really a definitive chronicle of that period. I mean, so yeah, and he passed away, a while back too. But so those are some of the people that made an enormous impression on me that your listeners might have heard of or could Google easily enough.
Absolutely, yes. I was wondering about your thoughts on Alexander Haig. We've talked about him a few times on the show, more specifically in dealing with Watergate issues. But he's very famous, or you could say infamous, for "I'm in charge here," which he said after the Reagan assassination attempt by John Hinckley in March of 1981. And I've wondered what your opinion of Haig was in that statement then, as opposed to now when we've sort of had the perspective of history behind us.
Well, I mean, Haig was, a soldier and an honorable figure, but, I'll say it, kind of a nut. And, and a drinker, definitely a drinker. I observed that at the time. And was ill-suited for his position. He looked like a Secretary of State or a president and had the kind of swagger to him and was sort of handsome and well-spoken. But he was just not of sound mind. And, and he ran for president in 1988 and sort of demonstrated again that he was not anything that anybody would want in the Oval Office. And so, again, like a lot, he's an example of the Peter principle. He was a good military officer, a good staffer, and could not rise beyond that and shouldn't have and didn't.
Right. And I had Ray Locker on the show twice. He wrote Haig's Coup, and there is a theory out there that sort of Haig sort of walked hand in hand with Richard Nixon to the exit door, that Haig was the exit strategy for the enemies of Nixon, and that Haig is at least in great part responsible for the terrible decisions made at the end. And there is that theory out there.
Yeah, the Watergate. I don't know. I mean, I've read plenty about Watergate, including from our mutual friend James Rosen, and on those kind of questions as to who the culprit was, on Watergate, Deep Throat, and so on. I mean, that's an interesting, wormhole to dive into. But the ultimate blame goes to Nixon. I mean, he was president. He should have thought better about this and handled it better. And just while we're on that topic, I wrote a review of Jeff Shepard's book on Watergate, which very I can't remember the title of it. It's got Watergate in the title. Jeff, Geoff.
Yes, we know Jeff here pretty well. He's been on the show a few times. Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, he's a great guy and a good guy to have on your show. And he puts a lot of the blame on the Democrats, and they were just out to get out. The Teddy Kennedy presidential campaign was just out to get Nixon, and I certainly think that's true. However, Nixon was president, and it's hard to. I think Nixon was actually a pretty good president, but as with many people, had a rather serious tragic flaw.
Now, it was written at that time, and we know much more about this now since Reagan did develop Alzheimer's, but there was some concern towards the very end of his second term. There was some concern about his mental faculties at that point and whether or not he was fully capable of holding the office. From an insider's perspective that you had then and from an insider's perspective that you have now, being in the Beltway and being a columnist still, and then obviously talking to columnists and politicians on a daily basis there, is there some concern now about the faculties of Biden as well?
Oh, sure. And look, obviously this age takes its toll. That's just sort of a simple enough fact. Now, on President Reagan, but there's no question he was, observably slower, at the end of 8 years. And, every president ages dramatically in the office. And On the other hand, it is, we're seeing, and it's kind of a revelation to everybody, the Reagan diaries, which, you can actually see them, and they're actually, I'm not sure, but they seem that the copy of the actual, holographic diary seems to rotate between the Reagan Library in Simi Valley, California, and the Reagan Institute in Washington, D.C., and I've seen it in both places. Maybe there's one's a replica, but they're an astonishingly detailed, specific, diligent, dutiful recording of events for just about every day of his presidency, and you can just read them and see this is a clear mind functioning. Now, at the same time, you do get older. So, as for Biden, we'll see if there's some Biden diary tucked away somewhere that we don't know about that discovers that he was, actually really on top of things. But just to observe the guy on TV or on, Twitter videos, I think probably.
At this point, Jim, I'm finding it astonishing when you hear him talk and the sentences don't even really go together and they're not even on topic. And he's saying, oh, we'll militarily defend Taiwan, and then they have to walk it back. And now they're constantly having to walk things back. And when he's being shown the direction to walk and he just walks the other direction, or when he turns around, he's shaking hands with the air because there's no one there, but he's still doing the handshake motion. I mean, I don't even know what to say. And I laugh too. It is humorous to see, but you almost feel bad for him, and you feel bad that they're putting him out there like that. So there must be concern in Washington, and that's why I wondered if there was real concern from the insiders that you speak to on a daily basis.
Yes, I think most sort of insider Democrats, however defined, would predict that Biden is not the nominee in 24.
So I guess the question then is, if not Biden, then who?
I mean, again, it's Kamala Harris gets a worse press than just about anybody. But, I'm reminded of, Lyndon Johnson, who was despised by the Kennedy people in the early 60s. And then, one tragic day, he was president. And, so it's on her own merits, Harris wouldn't have much of a chance for anything. But biology could make her president at any time, and if she really puts her mind to it, she'd be hard to stop. On the other hand, the Democrats aren't dumb, so if it turns out that she gets, a job for $10 million a year at, the George Soros Foundation, take that instead. That would be certainly a clever exit that would open up the field to, any number of possibilities from, Pete Buttigieg to Gavin Newsom to, Chris Murphy. The list of Democrats who would be available to run for president in 24 is, as extensive as the list of Republicans.
Well, as they say, I guess time will tell. Now, Jim, I became aware of you first in the very early 2000s on Fox News Watch, which was on the Fox News channel on the weekends. And I loved that show. I thought it was the best media panel of its kind. It was hosted by Eric Burns, and the panel that I remember most and enjoyed the most was you and Cal Thomas and Jane Hall and Neil Gabler.
Right.
I thought you all did a very good job on the show. It was obviously a bipartisan effort. But I remember it being a valuable show to me at the time, but I also thought it was a valuable show for the news viewer as well. What do you think made that show valuable?
It was valuable, and thank you. It was a fun show to do. And I was on, happened to be on from about 1998 to 2013 or so. It was one thing that the producer Tom Bird kept emphasizing was talk about the media. We're not here to just have one more discussion of Bush or Obama or whoever. It's talk about media coverage, and so that gave us a kind of distinction, as in what these guys aren't here to just discuss the pros and cons of the Iraq War or Obamacare or something. They're here to talk about how the media are covering it, and that was a good piece of guidance that Tom, kept enforcing on us. And it's a reminder that, these shows are team efforts. And, Eric was a great, host, and it was a great panel, and we were well produced.
I thought Eric Burns was a fantastic host, actually. I like John Scott, and he was fine, but I thought the show was really meant for Eric Burns to host. It was really his, and I thought he handled everyone fairly. I thought you and Cal Thomas were good from the right. I thought Jane Hall and Neil Gabler defended the left remarkably well, and sure, we had CNN's reliable sources, which purported to be doing the same sort of media criticism, but I think that reliable sources often ended up just sort of being one of those talking head political discussion shows that talked about the news, where Fox News Watch really did, as you described, stuck to its mission of discussing the coverage of the news and not the news. And I, for one, would really like to see more of that today. But the problem is that I have zero confidence whatsoever that the same networks that are poster boys for the problem right now are really going to create another place where fair analysis of itself can be done. And the media, the media, in my view, is really falling apart at the seams, Jim. But sometimes I wonder if that's not really kind of a good thing. And as we saw throughout the Trump years, it does not like to be criticized, though, as you know, it made its bones criticizing others for hundreds of years, but it never likes that spotlight to be reversed, which of course goes back to then the ideas of who watches the watchers and the guy screaming out, "One of these days I'm going to do a story on you." But the media also constantly likes to award itself, like all the entertainment industries do, which is very self-serving. But you've been in the media for 30 years now, and you understand its psychology, especially inside the Beltway. So I have to ask you, just what in the world is going on with the media right now?
Well, I mean, it's funny. I mean, first of all, I've been here for 40 years. I moved here in 1980.
Right, but in the media for 30 years.
So I mean, it's funny. You mentioned Newswatch and all, and just yesterday, Andrew Sullivan, sort of, heterodox, more conservative than not preacher, took note of some story in the Washington Post that the Post headline was something like, "We called 16 video game makers to ask them what they thought about Roe versus Wade and what they were going to do about it." That was the Post headline. And Andrew tweeted in response, "This isn't journalism. This is activism. This is just, they're not covering news. They're trying to make news." And that was always, something they always tried to emphasize at Fox. You guys, and including the news division, you're here to cover the news and maybe talk about the news and discuss the news and so on. But you're not here to, try and make news. You're not here to, start some incident or something. And the point that Andrew was making, on Twitter, I think yesterday, was, look, you guys are activists, not journalists. And that would have been a great Newswatch segment. And, of course, that's part of the challenge, is that now the news is sort of, everything. Everybody on social media is kind of part of the news. But, it's put it in the category of good problems to have if there's so much stuff to cover that you'd sort of feel like, drinking from a fire hose kind of thing. So yeah, it would have been fun to still keep the show going, and and I'm sure there's various versions of it. I've sort of lost track of what's on cable news now. It's so drowned in social media and everything else that I don't actually spend much time watching cable news anymore. But it would be, I'm sure somebody has figured out some new way to do this in some sort of virtualized mechanism. And that was the other point about how the Beltway is processing all this. It's funny that the media is so proliferated. Again, every 332 million Americans can all claim now in some tiny way to be part of the media, all sort of the media. And so in that sense, the individual impact of any journalistic source, including, Fox News, including CNN, including the New York Times, I think has been diminished. I think, there's a collectivity now that subordinate to any one brand. On the other hand, at the same time, there's only one president. There's 1 million TV channels now, and there's one president. There's 10 million Twitter feeds that people would think are important, and there's only one Congress. There's only one Supreme Court. So in a funny way, the relative scarcity of Beltway, U.S. government, federal government, Uncle Sam institutions is sort of, I think, kind of in a funny way making them sort of more important, because it's like, the supply of gold, there's only so much of it.
Right. And I was thinking about the expansion of news the other day, because I remember fondly the 1992 campaign. I was in college, and it was the first national campaign in which I was eligible to vote. So I wanted to be very involved, and I was. But not only was I very involved, it seems like everyone I knew was involved and very much invested in that campaign. And we're not talking about the Beltway here. We're talking about rural southern Illinois, and everyone was still invested in that campaign. But I remember going home at night, and I remember watching cable news for the entirety of the evening, and I would even record some on my VCR during the day, because there were some shows on when I was at school. There were some shows that I liked. I mean, it was important, and it was the first 24-hour news cycle election, and, you had shows like, the McLaughlin Group and Crossfire and the Capital Gang that were getting huge ratings, at least for the time. And, new stories were being made on Larry King Live, and Saturday Night Live was must-see television for its election parodies. And Dana Carvey was doing both George Bush and Ross Perot on Saturday Night Live. And so, to me, an election has never felt the same way that it felt in 1992. I mean, sure, 2016 was angrier on both sides, and because of social media, 2020 had everyone engaged, but it was even angrier on both sides than it had been in 2016. But Jim, do you remember 1992 being as seminal for news coverage in the way that I do?
I do. I worked in the 1992 Bush campaign, and I, helped George Bush Sr. lose that year. And yeah, we were frankly very much kind of outgunned, and outwitted by the Clinton people. They were just, I'm not a Bill Clinton fan, and I am a George Bush fan, but, Clinton ran a much better campaign. And they were just very hip to the cycle, as we used to call it, again, and very aware that, again, I mean, I can remember, in the 84 Reagan campaign, which I also worked in, much more successful. They would say to us that if you want an event to be on the nightly news, Reagan making a speech or something like that, you have to have it wrapped up by 3 p.m. or so Eastern time. Because it would take the networks 3 or 4 hours to put the story together. That was just the nature of the technology, the nature of the everything. And so we had said, okay, we just, and now, I mean, correction, by 1992, George Stephanopoulos and James Carville and these people who were smart on the Clinton campaign said, look, we can make news at 5:30 or 6:30. I mean, we can just go right into it. And it was just a different world where, again, it seems sort of obvious, but it, as with everything, it's only obvious in retrospect when it's happening and the artillery is landing all around you. You don't necessarily think clearly about what you're supposed to be doing.
Right, and you worked with Mike Huckabee in 2008, and I want to ask you about that, because one of the more appealing things to me about Huckabee was the idea of serious prison reform. We've talked about it on the show before, and we'll talk about it again. Now, Americans are the most incarcerated people in the world per capita, much more than the Chinese are, but yet we always think, oh, if you do anything wrong in China, you're going to prison. Well, that actually describes America better than it does China. And at the same time, we also brag somewhat embarrassingly about our Christian value that everyone should be given a second chance in life. But when push comes to shove, tough on crime laws are popular, and they were not ever more so than the 1990s, as we know, the 1993 crime bill. Now, what we do, though, is we incarcerate people and say, okay, but when you get out, we're going to give you a second chance. Well, but now they're on paper, and now they have a background, and now they have all these things that make life much harder for them. So we're really not giving them a chance. Well, Huckabee took a lot of heat for this, pointing to the failures of any system that he supported, even though there will be failures to every system that's out there because some people do fail. But I think we have to start somewhere, and I think that's what Mike Huckabee thought as well. So not only was he right about this, but he was quite ahead of the curve, was he not?
I think Mike Huckabee is a great man. If you had to make a list of people who the country would have been better off if he'd been president, I certainly put him high on the list of people who, wouldn't but should have. And yeah, look, I agree in many, many ways. Huckabee anticipated, the better angels of, Trumpism. He was concerned about blue collar workers. He was concerned about ordinary people, including, the damned and the dispossessed. And from a Christian conservative point of view, and that's what the world is sort of looking for is sort of a center right welfare state, not a left, not the welfare state that funds abortions and crack pipes, but the welfare state that says, look, keep the baby, keep your family together, get a job, and we'll make sure that we'll do everything we can to help you. That's what people would vote for if it was offered to them, and Huckabee was offering that.
Well, yes, and I know the phrase "compassionate conservative" as a label has been bandied around for 20 years, most of all by George W. Bush. But I really thought maybe Bush didn't fit it, and in fact, I don't think he fit it at all. But I do think that Mike Huckabee did. I think Mike Huckabee's heart was in the right place. It's just it's hard to sell yourself to the American public, and what happened. And so. To healthcare. I want to go to healthcare because I saw a video of you recently, and though you're on the right, you had made a case for supporting universal healthcare, which I thought was fascinating. My problem with it is your problem with it, and we both have a real fear that the obesity epidemic and diabetes, which if you lifestyle your way into diabetes, it costs $30,000 a year in healthcare. And yes, I said lifestyle your way into it. Most type 2 diabetes cases are lifestyled into, and they can be lifestyled out of. But it becomes quite the burden when obesity becomes an epidemic. So your thoughts on healthcare were very interesting.
Well, I think the issue of national health insurance has been a positive for government since Bismarck created it in Germany, I think in 1883, give or take. And the same thing with old age pensions. And there's just certain basics of what a society needs to fully function. And, again, Bismarck was no liberal. And just from a completely conservative point of view, this is what social order and social peace require. And most countries in the world have moved in that direction. And I think, frankly, the debate has been pretty much settled by COVID. There's just the thought that, if somebody had said, well, you can only get vaccinated if you pay, or you can only get boosted if you pay, or, so on. And the private sector will have to wait for the private sector to come up with a vaccine. It just would have, I won't say never happened, but it would have been a long time coming. A lot more people would have been dead. There would have been a lot more chaos and lockdowns and everything else. So just the basic simplicity of, I've been vaccinated and boosted, and each time I just showed up to the pharmacy and said, I need and they said, okay, here's your shot, and they put a little check mark on my card and stuff. And I realize not everybody wants to get vaccinated and boosted, and that's fine. But most people, 80+% of Americans have been vaccinated. And so I think that sort of settled the issue. And I think, Republicans may or may not, every now and then make a statement about we're going to repeal Obamacare. But, I think it'll be more, gestural than anything else. Now, as the diabetes issue, that is an issue. And all those kinds of problems, if the government is on the hook for chronic, debilitating, wildly expensive diseases like, diabetes or Alzheimer's, to name another one, that's a problem, which then gets you into, all right, what can we do to reduce, obesity. I'm not sure what to do about Alzheimer's, but I think the diabetes thing is clear enough with obesity. And then you'll wind up with a system, hopefully, that is just encouraging people to lose weight and stay in shape and so on. And that'll, the Democratic sort of regulatory expert, Cass Sunstein, writes a book about every 6 months. And a lot of them have to do with, and he wrote one book called Nudge, which is sort of what it sounds like in terms of, look, hey, you really want that extra cigarette or extra, a piece of pie. And I think that the system, again, it doesn't have to be the government, but it'll be, the American Heart Association, and whatever other groups saying, look, we need to be healthy. And it's those kinds of, public service campaigns that worked on, forest fires and litter and, other things. And I think that's, we'll see more of that. I mean, one of the things that I'm most proud of working on, and going back to the Bush 41 days, was I was sort of the liaison on the President's Council on Physical Fitness and Sports with, the then Chairman Arnold Schwarzenegger. And, it was just a good thing to see for the country, to see the President Bush, who was very much in shape and was a jogger and, watched his diet and so on. That was, I think, salutary to the country to see this is a guy who cares about fitness, and so therefore if the president can do it, you should too.
Yes. Now, Jim, you've often described yourself as Hamiltonian, which obviously makes me wonder if you've seen Hamilton the musical and what you thought about it historically.
I have seen Hamilton, and I'm hard of hearing, and so there was no way that I would have been able to hear the lyrics on the stage. So before I taught at the Kennedy Center here in D.C., a year or two ago, and 2 or 3 years ago, I guess. And before that, I just Googled the lyrics. Unfortunately, they're all online, and so I sort of read through them closely so that the chance that the linkage between my memory of what I'd been reading that afternoon and what I was hearing, in the theater that night was pretty good. So yeah, I thought it was very good. I mean, I admit I'm not much of a rap music fan, but from an historical point of view, I was sort of astonished at how detailed it was and respectful of the material. The material being, the story of Hamilton and the Revolution and so on. I thought I give them a lot of credit for both, fidelity and sort of creativity at the same time. And it was a sort of a daring, clever move to make, half the cast, black or Hispanic and so on. That was just sort of made it sort of interesting and obviously broadened its appeal to a lot of people, which I'm all for. The more people who know about Hamilton and Ron Chernow's biography of him and the show itself, the better. And I find it sort of, a way for liberals to sort of say, hey, capitalism is pretty good.
Well, we've come to that point in the show where I must both say thank you and massively apologize. About 20 years ago, I stole your line, information wants to be free, which is something you said on Fox News Watch quite often. And I just loved it. I still love it. I still use it. So it interests me sort of where you found the line and your history with the line, because it became the sort of quintessential Jim Pinkerton line.
Well, I think I did say it a lot on Fox, mostly to annoy somebody that you didn't mention, Jeff Cohen, who was on before Neil Gabler. The quote, the words itself, I think, again, somebody could research this, including both of us. I think it comes from the late John Terry Barlow, the sort of Grateful Dead lyricist who wrote the Declaration of Independence with cyberspace in about 1992, which was a kind of sincere and naive document as to what would happen with the internet and so on. But but certainly the concept of of information as a thing, and so, going back to Richard Dawkins, as a meme, and Dawkins was one who coined the phrase, which is more profound, meme, M-E-M-E, as a sort of a thought that has sort of its own kind of life, like a bacteria or like a cell. And once you think that way, you say, yeah, look, we're letting loose thoughts here, and if they get noticed, and if they get picked up, and if they get repeated, then as it were, the cat is out of the bag, and you're not going to get, to take another tired analogy, you're not going to get the toothpaste back in the tube. But I think that this has vast implications for the ability of governments and regimes and orthodoxies to control thinking. And I think that the human impulse to think and to produce a thought and to spread it around is so strong that it does represent, and I'm sort of heartened by this, a permanent challenge to anybody's attempt to impose a clampdown.
Well, yes. And, I've always thought that as well. And I've always thought that, three of the more horrifying stories of the last 10 to 20 years are those of Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, and Edward Snowden. You think information wants to be free, but information can also be a very dangerous thing. And are there things that White Houses will never tell us? Yes. Are there a lot of things that the Pentagon will never tell us? Yes. But I do think that information sort of is like water in that it finds its way through any crack in the street, in the armor, and it sort of finds its way to the light. It finds its way to freedom. So anyway, I did steal the line, so thank you very much for that.
Well, yeah, I think that, water, finds a cleft and flows upward. It evaporates, I guess is what you want to say. But yes, one way or another, in some form, whether it's, gas, liquid, or solid, water, whether it's evaporating into the sky or breaking up the sidewalk with ice, it has a force to it. And I sort of think that this whole business with Ukraine and Russia has sort of reminded us once again of the value of and the honor of free thinking and free associations and discussions and so on. And it's ask Putin what it's like to deal with somebody who really does sort of understand, the value and the spectacular quality of freedom, and that's namely Zelensky, and who's winning this battle. To me, it's very clear, and I think it's then you look at China, and you think all this stuff they're doing with lockdowns and things, and it's what an unpleasant place to be. And how much better it is to be someplace where you can go to the 7-Eleven without being arrested. And I make it the whole the unbelievable tragedy of Ukraine has a silver lining in terms of reminding us that information wants to be free, and frankly so do people.
Yes. And I also think that people want to be respected, and they want to not be shut down instantaneously on social media or by the news media for their views, which I think is happening to both the genuine left and genuine right at this point. I was taught in college that the political continuum was this straight line, and that you have the far left and the far right, and they were at polar opposites. However, over the years, I've really come to buy this horseshoe theory that the far left and far right are actually both right there at the bottom, and they want the same things, often for vastly different reasons. But both the genuine left and the genuine right were against the Russiagate stories propagation. They were against any talk of vaccine mandates. They are both very anti-censorship. And the section that opposes the most is that sort of massive wing at the top. And it's made up of establishment politicians favored by both the DNC and the RNC. And Tulsi Gabbard on the left isn't that far from Ron and Rand Paul on the right. They do have domestic disagreements and for various reasons. But both are on opposite ends, I think, from Bill and Hillary Clinton, from the Bush family, from the Obamas, from Biden, McCain, Romney, Pelosi. All of their ideologies are completely at odds with both Tulsi Gabbard and Ron and Rand Paul. And I don't necessarily like the demonization that I see of either the genuine left or the genuine right. And I hate the phrases alt-left and alt-right. the left is there and it's loud and it's voiced by writers such as Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald and Caitlin Johnstone and Whitney Webb and Aaron Mate and Elizabeth Voss. And they're very critical of the White House right now because they expected more. Well, Ron Paul was also very critical of Republican White Houses and refused to back down because he expected more. The media, however, just like the DNC and RNC, has serious contentions with both sides. So what do you think the future is for those who associate either generally or loosely or specifically with the Gabbard left or the Paul right?
Yeah, I agree on the horseshoe, and I also agree on the middle part of the horseshoe. The horseshoe is an image which is sometimes called the uniparty, and which is sort of centrism. And I look, I'm very sympathetic to the argument. I think it's a recognizable phenomenon, and it comes in sort of this light form, which is sort of Trump and Bernie Sanders, and a dark form, which is, Hitler and Stalin. And there's something definitely more than a little bit to that. But I think we've also seen again, Ukraine comes to mind as a reminder, look, there is what Arthur Schlesinger back in 1949 called a vital center. And it too has real power. In other words, I think, I think the Tulsi Gabbard, Rand Paul may block for a day or two, the $40 billion for Ukraine, but he's doing it on a procedural thing, which is his right as a senator to do. But I don't think he's going to stop the money from going. And I think that the vote in the House on the Ukraine aid was 370 to 50 or something. So the wings of the horseshoe are interesting to study, and it's a real phenomenon. But I think the story of 2022 has been the power of, for lack of, if you want to say it this way, the establishment said, look, who are we for? Are we for Putin or Zelensky? And, you can put that to a vote of the American people, and I think it's about, 4-1 Zelensky, which is to say, the establishment is right about something.
Yes, we disagree a little bit on Ukrainian issues, I can tell you that, but this is not that interview. So, but yes, I do. I do agree that the establishment is obviously way ahead here. And the genuine left and the genuine right, as I like to call them, are sort of falling behind, but I think they're valuable. I think we need people to stand up against two parties who have become establishment and purposely have become establishment. And I do think that's valuable. And I think it will remain valuable as well. I do think people like Tulsi Gabbard and Ron Paul or Rand Paul are really good. And I do see this movement growing on both sides. I hate the word extremists as well, just like I hate alt left and alt right, because extreme compared to what? Extreme compared to what? The uni party, as you called it, the middle, the establishment. At some point it gets to a place where we should maybe be extreme compared to them. Not extreme in our actions, not even extreme in our words, but we should do something else. And for reasons that aren't because lobbyists would like us to do X, Y, and Z. And so I see great value in both the left and the right.
Well, I think somewhere in here, the Gabbard, I say more Trump than Rand Paul. I think of Rand Paul as a libertarian, which sort of, in a weird way, puts him kind of in with the sort of the neoliberals, but Trump more clearly, or Marine Le Pen, or Orban of Hungary. Pick your figures. I think they've made some pretty substantial victories, which are sort of hidden. And the one that was startling to me was the Biden administration's massive rollout of its supply chain issues, the supply chain goals on February 24th. Now, February 24th will be remembered forever as the day that the Russians invaded Ukraine, so it sort of blanked it out. But it's obviously online. The White House vision of supply chain reform, including extending nuclear licenses, which is to say, a repudiation of the standard green idea that we should get rid of nuclear power. The Biden administration wants to extend it. Now, again, I'm not a fan of Biden. I'm just sort of observing that basic ideas like let's make it inside, which definitely unite Trump and Gabbard. I'm not sure about Rand Paul, but definitely unite the MAGA crowd, if you will, plus the sort of Bernie Sanders crowd, which is, let's have good jobs and good wages here in the United States. I think that is becoming, it's creeping into, the conventional wisdom. And which is to say the establishment, has sort of quietly embraced it, just out of fear of nothing else. And I think that's the sign of a healthy system, where an idea from the fringe, which gains traction, is therefore sort of absorbed, or to use the Star Trek phrase, bored into current policy. And I think that's the Biden administration is sort of stumbling in toward the continuation of a lot of the Trump policies that had made a lot of sense, and I supported, the most obvious one being energy independence. I mean, Trump was a big champion of energy independence, and Biden, came in with his, 30-year-old woke staff as a, green, so on. And now, he's being forced by events to scramble around and say, okay, how do we at least pretend to want to produce more? And again, I see all the articles, too, about they're actually insincere on leases and oil and gas and whatever. I see all that. I think I'll predict by the end of 2024, by the end of Biden's first and I suspect only term, the United States will be producing more oil and gas than it did when Trump left office.
The 2016 Trump phenomenon was surprising to some, not in hindsight, though. I did an article, I did a pretty lengthy article last year, I think it was, about that 2016 support, which, by the way, I want to point out to everyone out there, I find very different from the 2020 support. I sort of feel like the Stop the Steal, the QAnon people, all of this sort of took over the base Trump support in those 4 years and made it something that it was not in 2016. But being a Midwesterner, Jim, I sort of saw this idea that we're in a flyover state, which is a very derogatory term to someone in the Midwest, that we don't matter, is that if you don't touch an ocean, you're unimportant in American policy. And it's not something that has sat well with people between the coasts. And we've always sort of felt bullied by the mainstream media and our national politicians in that way. At worst, or we feel bullied. At best, we feel ignored. And so when Trump came along, he wasn't the bully to the 2016 supporters. He was the kid who moved into town and started beating up the bullies. And again, that morphed between 2020, between 2016 and 2020. But what I'm trying to say here is that when you look at that 2016 support, individually, it's very easy to understand, especially as a Midwesterner, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, it's so striking. I mean, Illinois being an exception because of Chicago, but the strength of, Ohio and Iowa used to be, swing states, and now they sort of seem to be pretty solidly Republican. I mean, that's the main two states, on either side of Illinois. And Indiana, the Midwest seems to be coming. I mean, this is a point made by people like Charlie Cook. The rural Midwest is now becoming like the rural South in terms of its Republicanism. And that's, they do notice in, Waverly, Minnesota, what, the East Coast and the West Coast and New York City and LA and DC think of that. That's what I keep telling my friends who live in these, blue enclaves. Look, you got to understand, every time Rob Reiner opens his mouth, people in, Howard Lake, Minnesota, think the opposite. Okay, what Rob Reiner is for, I'm against it. Simple. And the math is so catastrophic for sort of blue dot liberalism that eventually they'll figure out not to do it anymore, but eventually.
Right. But what is really mind-boggling to me is that rather than taking a moment to step back and try to understand the 2016 support, because it can wave both directions, it was just trying to find someone to speak for them, to champion them. They can go either direction, but rather than trying to take time to understand them, they've chastised them. They've called them deplorables who just cling to their God and their guns. And they still today call them horrible things. And they're not necessarily hardcore Republicans. They were Trump supporters. They were Trump supporters in 2016, and then most of them remain Trump supporters in 2020. But they can be had, and they can be had by someone who comes along and makes a case, and makes a good case why they support those states between the coasts.
Yeah, I mean, look at, take a great, I don't say great, but a significant Illinois figure, Sherry Bustos, the soon-to-be former congresswoman. All Sherry Bustos, who represented, Rockford, give or take, in Northwest Illinois, did was, as a Democrat, was win a Republican seat and hang on to it for, 3 or 4 terms. And then for her trouble, they called her, every insult you can think of, and they drove her into retirement. And yeah, so there's a Democrat who could demonstrably win a red district, and they hated her for it. Go figure.
Yes. Go figure. My home state of Illinois. Always a shining spot in the heart of America. So we're going to wrap this up today. I want to thank Jim Pinkerton, formerly of Fox News Watch. Now he's a columnist, worked in the Reagan White House. Is a Beltway man, proudly a Beltway man, knows a lot about what's going on there. And I've always wanted to interview you. I've always wanted to ask you about Fox News Watch. I've always wanted to ask you about Information Wants to Be Free. So this was a real honor. Thank you so much.
Oh, well, you're welcome, and thank you, and we'll do it again sometime.
Yes, we will absolutely do this again. Thank you. Jim Pinkerton, from the other side of the mountain, on the best side of midnight. I wish you.
Man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. You only choose sides based upon the rhetoric. The truth is nefarious, the slow flow of evidence, and lies on both sides. Got to admire their cleverness. But the code of personality is venomous. The power keeps ascending, agendas are so treacherous. They 10 steps ahead of us, cementing their survival. And y'all just applaud and fall for these false idols who slither through the snake pits, dark shadows and shape shift. Devalue the paper, less power for you to play with. State agents operating so flagrant. Suits and jackboots for us peasants and vagrants. Leviathan monster, federal mobsters. Socioeconomic warfare tactics, divide and conquer. Stop and ponder for a minute how they prosper. Insert them in disguise and you don't realize what they sponsor. They rotate the scapegoats, stockpiles of banknotes. Control everything from lab coats to fake votes. Smile in your face when they strip you of your freedom. Continuously telling you lies, why you believe them. Government conditioning, dunk down education. The school to prison pipeline fueling incarceration. Speak in pursuit of the truth and be met with violence. Because one way or another they want to obtain your silence. Common sense questions they never want you to ask. Like how much can they take with some beer and a mask? And the ultimate hypocrisy is that they're spreading freedom and democracy by supporting corrupt corporate monopolies. Mainstream media ain't telling the truth either, but you entertained by their high-stakes kabuki theater. Pit us against each other, watch us burn it down to